Urgent, yes, captures another Russian tanker from the notorious Shadow Fleet. We'll talk about this with David Tafuri, international lawyer and former US State Department official. David, glad to see you, and thank you for joining us.
Great to see you. Thank you.
David, for Russian ships, there is no longer a quiet and safe harbor anywhere in the world. Recently, the United States carried out two detonations of oil tankers associated with the Russian Shadow Fleet. The first was the tanker Marinera in the Atlantic Ocean, and the second was the tanker Sophia in the Caribbean Sea. This is an unprecedented operation involving the detention and escort of a vessel that had demonstratively flown the flag of the Russian Federation, Marinera. Notably, the Sofia did not change its Panamanian flag under which it had been sailing. But what is Trump's real interest in the seizure of the two Russian tankers, in your opinion?
From what we can tell and what the Trump administration has said, right now their main interest is in ensuring that all Venezuelan oil that is trying to be transported, especially if it's being transported by ships that have been sanctioned, can be seized by the US. And the Trump administration has suggested they intend to take the value of that oil. It's not clear what they're going to use the value for, whether it's going to be held for the people of Venezuela or it's going to be confiscated to compensate the Trump administration for its operations in Venezuela. But their stated interest is in cracking down on the ability of Venezuela to sell its oil abroad. This obviously has secondary impacts, including on the war in Ukraine.
Uh, what message do these detentions send to Russia and operators of the Shadow Fleet worldwide?
So it certainly sends a message to Russia that the US is going to take action against any party, including Russia, if they're helping Venezuela sell their oil. It is not clear if there's a larger message from the US to try to force Russia not to use tankers that have been sanctioned to transport oil from other countries, including from Russia. Obviously, we do have US sanctions on the Russian oil industry. They're not pervasive, but they've increased and been ratcheted up, especially over the last few months. And those sanctions reach some of the companies that are helping deliver and ship oil. And it's not clear if the Trump administration is going to do more of a crackdown on the vessels that are enabling the transport of Russian oil, or whether this is just limited to vessels that are transporting Venezuelan oil, whether they be Russian or otherwise.
David, at the same time, if Washington truly wanted to put pressure on Russia's fleet, it would provide Ukraine with weapons to strike at the port of Novorossiysk, for example. Therefore, the loss of two tankers is an inconvenience, but not an event that would change Putin's position on the war against Ukraine or on peace negotiations. Isn't that the case? Also, your thoughts?
You make a good point, and perhaps that's one of the things the Trump administration is considering. But for now, it's not very clear what the Trump administration intends to do about the illegal war in Ukraine by Russia. And this these developments with Venezuela and other countries where the US is focusing may have distracted it from its attention to the war in Ukraine. And so we seem to be in this moment where there's a pause on emphasis on trying to solve the war in Ukraine, while the Trump administration focuses on Venezuela and some other areas.
We see that the United States has just seized its third Russian oil tanker, Olina, this time in the Caribbean Sea, according to the Wall Street Journal. What do you know about the circumstances surrounding the seizure of the Russian tanker Olina in the Caribbean Sea? Um, your own opinion about this?
I think this is just, further confirmation that the US is going to limit the ability of anyone helping Venezuela sell its oil, and that there are going to be significant consequences if you're involved in helping Venezuela sell oil, including the confiscation of the boarding of your vessel, and perhaps the confiscation of its cargo, especially if that cargo is oil. And so that's the message. It's also not clear what talks have happened between the US and Russia, though I suspect there have been some communications, because there's been some reporting to suggest that Russia intended to send a submarine to protect one of these vessels that was seized. And that could have led to a confrontation between the US military and the Russian military, but that has not happened so far. So perhaps Russia backed off, maybe because of communications from the Trump administration.
The Wall Street Journal, citing informed sources, reports that by gaining access to the world's largest oil reserves in Venezuela, the United States could increase exports, which would lead to an even greater drop in prices. In this scenario, Russian Urals crude could fall to 30 dollars per barrel. And US President Donald Trump plans to secure his country's dominance in Venezuela's oil industry, as we understand, and as you said, which would help lower oil prices to the desired level of 50 dollar per barrel. How realistic is the projection that increased Venezuelan oil exports could lower Russian Urals crude to around $30 per barrel?
I think the analysis that leads to the conclusion that we could have a huge drop in oil is solid and makes sense. It's logical, but a lot of things need to happen before we get there. And it's not clear if those things will happen. For instance, with respect to Venezuela's oil sector, the US has said they're going to take over the oil sector and they're going to take some of the oil as compensation for the nationalization of the oil sector many years ago in Venezuela. But the Trump administration has not committed to putting troops on the ground, especially the type of large presence that would be necessary to really take over the oil sector in Venezuela without the collaboration and consent from the government in Venezuela, which so far it has not given. And moreover, this would require American companies going into Venezuela, so they would have to feel secure and safe. And they would have to put a lot of money in order to increase production because many of the oil wells need refurbishment, they need new technology, and that takes a lot of investment by the American companies. And so all of those things have to happen in order to increase production and for the US to be able to manage that production from Venezuela in a way that would have a substantial impact on oil prices.
Uh, what would be the economic consequences for Russia if, for example, Urals crude were to fall to $30 per barrel?
Well, that would really hurt Russia's economy. I mean, it's really relying on the sale of oil and gas to continue to have revenues that it needs to support the war machine in Russia that it's illegally using in Ukraine. And so any pressure on the Russian economy is a positive for justice in Ukraine and for the potential for there to be sufficient pressure on Putin that he's willing to enter into a ceasefire that is fair on terms that are just for the Ukrainian people. But right now, we don't know if that's going to happen. There have been other efforts in the past, obviously, to hurt Russia's oil sector, including sanctions, including the price cap that was put in place by the G7 countries on the sale of Russian oil and the limits on what you could pay for Russian oil. Certainly, if the U.S. and Europe were to collaborate together and decide they want to hurt the Russian oil sector more, they could do that by increasing sanctions and increasing enforcement of sanctions, maybe putting in place a new price cap, and maybe also working together and with partners in the Middle East and other oil producing areas around the world to increase production to lower the price that Russia can get.
We hope. And um, About Mexico, Trump announced military action against Mexico. He said, "We will take action on the ground against the cartels. The cartels are running Mexico. It is very sad to see what has happened to this country. How might this announcement affect U.S. Mexico relations and regional stability? What's next?"
Well, this is one of the things I was referring to when I said that the Trump administration has its attention on other areas. So they've been talking about Mexico. President Trump made those comments that you mentioned. It's not clear what he means exactly. You would hope that if the U.S. intends to do military action in Mexico, we would do that in cooperation with the government in Mexico City, and that we would have their support for doing that. Were we to do it without the support of the government in Mexico, there could be legal issues. It's not clear what the justification would be. Certainly, the U.S. has its right to defend itself against the transport of illegal drugs and illegal weapons into the U.S. across the border, but that's normally seen as a function of border control, not something that we use our U.S. military to do. Were we to use our U.S. military to intervene in Mexico for anything beyond, basic law enforcement against drug dealers and drug traffickers, you would need some further legal basis and justification.
Uh, David, really not only Mexico. Um, let's talk about Greenland. Political reports that Trump may offer Europe security guarantees for Ukraine in exchange for Greenland. This is reportedly one of four steps that could help the US president achieve his goal of privatizing Greenland. Um, how realistic is the idea that the US could exchange security guarantees for control over Greenland?
I think ideally it sounds like a trade that could make sense, but it can only be done if the government in Denmark and the government in Greenland, which is semi autonomous or autonomous territory of Denmark, agree. And they have a right to make a decision about their future and whether they would become part of the United States. Without their agreement, any trade or deal like that isn't going to work.
David, additionally, for sources cited by Reuters report that U.S. officials discussed the possibility of offering a one-time payment to the residents of Greenland to persuade them to separate from Denmark and potentially join the United States. What do you think about this?
I think it's another interesting idea. Obviously, if the US were to pursue that route, there would need to be some sort of referendum in Greenland where the people of Greenland got to decide. And perhaps they could make that decision with the understanding that there's going to be compensation for US taking control of Greenland. But those processes would take many months, if not years. And perhaps the Trump administration could coordinate something like that. But I think it's going to take a lot of negotiations with the leadership in Greenland and with Denmark.
Um, Also, about what is happening in Ukraine, you know that Russia struck Ukrainian Lviv region with hypersonic ballistic missile, the Oreshnik. Can we say that this attack on Western Ukraine is a signal to NATO? After all, the strike is geographically approaching alliance territory, which increases the risks of broader conflict.
Yes, unfortunately, while this new attack is tragic and devastating, it's not at all surprising. Russia sees no limits on its ability to use its most advanced weapons to strike at civilians and civilian infrastructure. Those are war crimes that Russia is committing, and it's just expanding its level of guilt and culpability for war crimes. But it also demonstrates that Putin probably isn't in a mode where he's considering a real ceasefire that would be fair to the Ukrainian people. He still wants to terrorize the Ukrainian people. He still wants to achieve the same objectives he's been talking about since the invasion in February 2022. And so, unfortunately, attacks like this remind us where Putin really is in terms of his view of Ukraine and the potential for a ceasefire.
And David, Putin is demonstrating nuclear potential without crossing a formal red line, a way to apply pressure without direct escalation. Isn't that so?
I think that's right. I think Putin is being careful about testing the boundaries with NATO, but not going too far to provoke and a military response from NATO, and that includes also, especially the United States. Russia has been very careful not to escalate with the United States or have inadvertent confrontations with the U.S. military. But what is not clear is whether that status quo can continue, because we seem to be on a path towards a collision between the interests of the US and NATO on one side and Russia on the other side. And it isn't at all entirely unlikely that there could be a confrontation, including a military confrontation, given the escalation.
David, the New York Times reports that Donald Trump stated he is ready to commit the US to Ukrainians' future defense if Russia violates a ceasefire and invades again. What exactly does this mean?
Well, I think this is a good thing. It shows a progression in the viewpoint of President Trump, because when he was on the campaigning for president, he said no way the United States would give a security guarantee to Ukraine. So this is a positive, and it could help Ukraine feel more comfortable with the possibility of a ceasefire. But as with any offer like this, you need to look at the details, and Ukraine needs to understand what exactly is the U.S. offering if it is giving a security guarantee. Under what basis would the U.S. act on that security guarantee? What would constitute an attack by Russia that results in the U.S. taking action against Russia? All of those things are a little more clear with the Article 5 obligation of NATO countries to defend other NATO countries. But because Ukraine is not in NATO, at least not yet, there isn't an Article 5 specific obligation to protect Ukraine. But what Ukraine should want is something similar to an Article 5 guarantee given by the United States. And my guess is if the United States were to give one, then many of the other countries in Europe, especially the biggest military powers in Europe, like the UK and France and Germany, would also make similar security guarantees. And those overlapping security guarantees could give Ukraine more comfort.
And we see that France and the United Kingdom and Ukraine have signed a declaration of intent regarding the future deployment of multinational forces in Ukraine after ceasefire is reached. So what about United States?
Well, I think the Trump administration has been reluctant to say they would commit troops to Ukraine, but anything is possible. As we saw with the security guarantee issue, the Trump administration's viewpoint can progress. But at this time, I don't see any indication that the Trump administration would provide troops. Moreover, it's important to note that although the UK and France and some other European countries have made those commitments to Ukraine, Russia has not agreed, and it's not clear if they would go forward or even be able to go forward without an agreement by Russia. This would have to be one of the terms in the ceasefire, and Russia has been consistently saying they will not agree to a ceasefire that results in European troops being in Ukraine.
David, if we're talking about France, I see that now in France, left wing political forces have initiated a resolution for a phased withdrawal from NATO, claiming that the alliance allegedly serves US interests rather than Europe's. How realistic is the proposed phased withdrawal from NATO in France? And To what extent do these claims that NATO serves US rather than European interests reflect broader public opinion in France?
Well, I don't think it's likely that that would happen. I think most French people, majority of the French population, appreciate the advantages of being part of NATO and the benefits that France has received as part of NATO. And so I don't expect that that resolution would pass and be successful. But it does show that there is a growing discontent in Europe and around the world for some of the actions by the Trump administration. There's suspicion about the Trump administration. And on the other hand, the Trump administration is also making suggestions about whether it is committed to NATO. So it's not good for the NATO alliance, which has been the most successful military alliance in modern times. And I think both sides, the US side and the European side, should think more carefully about what the impact would be were we to undermine NATO and were we to take steps that made NATO weaker. If anything, I think most countries and the populations in the countries in Europe and in the US believe that we need to make NATO stronger, not weaker.
And I agree with this. David, thank you so much for this important, as always, conversation. Thanks for supporting Ukraine and Ukrainian people. David Tafuri, international lawyer and former US State Department official, was with us today. David, thank you so much again. And please share this interview and continue supporting Ukraine, guys. And see you.
Thank you. Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава.